Lanterns bobbed like fireflies in the darkness, illuminating faces etched with a mixture of excitement and reverence. Tonight was no ordinary night. The moon hung unusually large and low, its pale light spilling like liquid silver across the placid surface of the lake. It was a sight that had drawn the entire village together, from the oldest elders to the youngest children, all eager to witness and celebrate what many whispered was a blessing from the heavens. Elias Morrow moved through the crowd with a familiar solitude, his lean frame cloaked in a weathered coat that had seen many seasons. His deep-set eyes, shadowed by years of hardship and loss, were fixed not on the revelry but on the moon itself. It hung there, impossibly close, its glowing orb seeming to hover just over the treetops, casting a luminous path across the water. Around him, laughter rose and fell, fires crackled, and the sweet notes of a fiddle filled the night air. Yet for Elias, the beauty of the scene was tinged with a gnawing sense of unease. He found a quiet spot on the rocky shore, where the water lapped gently at his boots. The reflection of the moon shimmered on the surface, fragmented by the slightest ripple, but still hypnotic in its glow. As he gazed into the depths, memories stirred of a time before the tragedies, before the village had grown so distant and wary. He thought of his wife, gone now these many years, and the silence that had settled over his life since. Yet beneath the sorrow was a sharper edge, an instinctual warning that something was not right. The villagers around him were caught in a collective trance, their eyes drawn to the orb that seemed to pulse with an unnatural light. Children pointed upward, their voices bright with wonder, while the elders exchanged knowing glances, some whispering prayers under their breath. Mara Lauren, tall and sharp-eyed, wove through the crowd, her green gaze scanning the faces with a protective vigilance. She paused near Elias, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention back to the gathering. Mara's presence was a reminder of the village's fragile balance between hope and fear, between the past and the unknown future. As the moon appeared to sink fractionally lower, the air seemed to thicken, the sounds of celebration momentarily dimming. A hush fell, subtle but charged with anticipation, as if the very lake held its breath. Elias's gaze flickered to the water's surface, where the reflection shimmered with an eerie intensity. For a moment, shapes seemed to flicker beneath the glow, distorted, fleeting forms that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Most villagers remained oblivious, caught in the enchantment of the descending moon, but Elias's heart tightened with dread. Sheriff Caltaine stood nearby, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the firelight, eyes scanning the crowd with a cautious pragmatism. He was a man who sought order in the face of uncertainty, skeptical of the tales and superstitions that clung to Glimmer Hollow like moss on stone. Yet even he could not deny the strange gravity that pulled at the village tonight. The moon's descent was no mere celestial event. It was a portent, a mystery that would unravel the fabric of their lives. As the first strains of a folk song rose again, mingling with the crackling fires and whispered stories, Elias remained rooted to the shore. The moon's glow bathed his weathered face, illuminating the lines carved by grief and resolve. The village celebrated beneath the fading sky, unaware of the shadow that stretched quietly across the water of darkness, waiting to be unleashed. And as the moon continued its slow, hypnotic descent, Elias knew that the night's wonder would soon give way to a terror none of them could have imagined. The moon's reflection rippled once more, and in its depths, the faintest whisper of movement stirred. A chill ran through Elias, sharp and sudden, as the boundary between the familiar and the unknown began to dissolve. The celebration would not last. The lake, the moon, and the villagers were bound together now in a dance of light and shadow, of beauty and dread. And Elias, watching the descending orb, felt the first tremors of a nightmare stirring to life beneath the surface. Along the water's edge, clusters of villagers had gathered, their faces illuminated by the moon's unusually bright and close descent. It was unlike any other night in memory. The moon's silvery light spilled over the lake like liquid mercury, casting long, trembling shadows that danced among the trees and whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. Laughter and low murmurs filled the air, a fragile veneer of celebration masking the subtle tremors of unease beneath. Children darted between adults, their voices sharp with excitement as they chased the moon's silvery glow reflected on the water's surface. Lanterns flickered here and there, their warm light a soft counterpoint to the cold luminescence above. Elias Marrow stood slightly apart from the crowd, a silent sentinel watching the spectacle. His eyes, deep set and shadowed by the weight of past sorrows, traced the moon's path as it seemed to inch ever closer to the lake. The reflection rippled and shimmered, a hypnotic dance of light that held a strange allure. Yet beneath the surface of wonder, a tightening knot of dread coiled in Elias's chest. The memory of his younger brother's disappearance lingered like a ghost, an ache beneath the night's beauty, as the villagers recounted old tales and speculated on the moon's bizarre behavior. Their voices wove a tapestry of lore and fear. It was then that Mara Lorne approached, her presence a sharp contrast to the revelry. Tall and fierce-eyed, Mara moved with purpose, her gaze searching the crowd until it landed on Elias. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition and unspoken questions passing between them. "Are you watching the moon too?" Mara's voice was low, urgent. Elias nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the shimmering lake. "It feels different tonight, like it's closer, too close." Mara's jaw tightened. "My brother vanished last week, just like that, drawn into the reflection, they say. The lake took him." Ilias's grip tightened on the rough fabric of his coat. "I'm sorry, Jonas. He's gone too." For a moment, the crowd around them seemed to fade, the sounds of celebration dimming into a distant hum. The two stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by loss and the shared terror of the unknown. Around them, the villagers' fascination with the moon deepened. Eyes glazed over, fingers reached cautiously toward the water as if sensing an invisible thread pulling them in. Some muttered prayers, others whispered warnings, but all were caught in the lunar spell's growing grip. In the shadows, Elias noticed subtle changes, a twitch in a man's eye, a tremor in a woman's hand. The moonlight seemed to warp reality, bending the edges of the world into something unfamiliar and frightening. Mara's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "We have to find out what's happening, before more of us disappear." Elias met her gaze, a flicker of resolve igniting in his own. "Then we'll start with the lake. Tonight," as the villagers' laughter echoed faintly behind them. The two began to weave through the crowd, their footsteps silent on the damp earth. The moon's reflection shimmered ahead, a gateway to secrets buried beneath the water's deceptive calm. The night was far from over, and with every heartbeat, the boundary between wonder and terror grew thinner. In the village of Glimmer Hollow, the moon was no longer just a distant light in the sky. It was a living presence, a force reaching deep into the hearts and minds of all who dared to watch. And Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that the true nightmare was only just beginning. Elias Marrow stood at the edge of the lake, the chill wind tugging at his worn jacket as his eyes fixed on the restless ripples. The lake, usually calm and steady, now quivered with a strange unease, as if the water itself were breathing. His gaze was drawn to the moon's reflection, where the familiar orb twisted and warped, rippling into grotesque, unsettling shapes that defied explanation. Elias's jaw tightened as he leaned closer, his breath fogging in the crisp night air. The reflection was no longer a simple mirror of the sky. It was a distortion, a fractured image that seemed alive with malevolence. Shadows flickered beneath the surface, dark shapes darting just beyond the reach of clarity. He felt a shiver crawl down his spine, a primal warning that something deep and terrible was stirring beneath the lake's placid facade. Behind him, the distant murmur of the village crept through the night, a low, restless hum of voices tinged with unease. The villagers of Glimmerharlow had begun to show signs of change. Elias had noticed it in the way they moved, their gazes flickering nervously toward the water, the strange murmurs that passed between them in hurried whispers. Faces once familiar were now etched with shadows of fear and confusion. As he turned away from the lake, Elias's steps carried him toward the village square, where a small crowd had gathered beneath the flickering lamps. The night was thick with a restless energy, the air heavy with a tension that seemed to grip the very bones of the town. Villagers spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting anxiously toward the water as if expecting something horrific to emerge. Among them, Elias spotted old Mrs. Daly, her hands trembling as she clutched a shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, once bright and clear, now flickered with a distant, vacant look. Nearby, young Thomas Hales paced nervously, muttering indistinctly about voices calling from the lake. The air thrummed with an undercurrent of paranoia, a collective unease that spread like wildfire. Elias's thoughts were interrupted by a firm hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Sheriff Calton's gruff face looming close, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of concern and impatience. "Elias," the sheriff said, his voice low but steady, "I've heard the rumors, but we can't let fear rule this town. There's no sense in jumping to conclusions. People are scared, that's all. We need calm, not chaos." Elias met Caltain's gaze, the weight of his words settling heavily between them. "This isn't just fear, Caltain," Elias replied, his voice tight. "There's something wrong with the lake. The reflection is not right. And the people, they're changing." Caltan's scowl deepened. "People get restless when the moon's so bright and low. They're imagining things." "I've seen it," Elias insisted. "Ripples that don't make sense, shadows beneath the water, faces in the reflection that shouldn't be there. Something's pulling at this place, and if we don't face it, it'll pull us all under." The sheriff shook his head, clearly unwilling to entertain the idea. "You're chasing ghosts, Elias. Try not to let your grief lead you down a dark path." Frustrated but undeterred, Elias left the square, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. He walked back toward the lake, the moon's glow casting eerie, elongated shadows across the path. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, indistinct melody that seemed to call to him, tugging at the edges of his sanity. At the water's edge once more, Elias knelt down and traced a finger through the cool surface. The ripples spread outward, distorting the moon's reflection further until it shattered into a fractured, trembling mosaic. For a moment, he thought he saw a Pfizer pale, watery visage, with eyes like black voids staring back at him from the depths. He jerked his hand back, heart pounding, breath ragged in the stillness. The lake was no longer just a body of water. It was a threshold, a veil between the known and the unknowable. And behind that veil lurked a darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear. As the night deepened, Elias remained by the lake, eyes scanning the surface for any sign, any clue to the growing madness that gripped Glimmerhollow. The villagers were changing, the moon's influence creeping into their minds like a slow poison. And somewhere beneath the shimmering reflection, something ancient and hungry waited. The lake whispered secrets Elias could almost understand, but the price of knowledge was steep. With every passing night, the boundary between reality and nightmare grew thinner, and Elias feared that soon there would be no returning from the depths beneath the surface. Yet, despite the dread that gnawed at his soul, Elias knew he could not turn away. The village depended on him, and if he was to face the encroaching darkness, it had to be now before the moon ate the lake whole, dragging Glimmerhollow into its cold, unyielding embrace. He stared upward, the distorted moonlight casting long shadows that danced like phantoms upon the water. And as the lake rippled one last time, Elias whispered a silent vow he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The night held its breath, waiting for the next ripple to break the fragile stillness, waiting for the madness beneath the surface to rise. And Elias felt the first sharp sting of fear, not for himself, but for all who called Glimmerhollow home. The villagers had gathered on the docks, their faces bathed in the moon's unnatural luminescence. What moments before had been celebration and wonder was now tinged with an uneasy hush, a collective breath held in anticipation. Elias Marrow stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping the railing as his eyes traced the moon's reflection. The water seemed alive, shimmering with a strange fluidity that made the image ripple and warp as if the lake itself were breathing. His heart pounded with a familiar, gnawing dread, one that clawed at memories he'd long tried to bury. A villager, a man named Tom, stepped closer to the water's edge. He was a stocky man in his 40s, with rough hands and a face lined by years of hard labor. Tom had laughed and joked with friends moments before, but now his gaze was fixed, almost entranced by the moon's glow. The crowd murmured softly, watching as Tom reached down to touch the water's surface, his fingers trembling. Then, something impossible happened. The reflection beneath Tom's hand shimmered violently, distorting like a broken mirror. His figure bent and twisted in the undulating light, his features fracturing as if the water sought to consume him. A low gasp rippled through the crowd, and before anyone could react, Tom's form disappeared, swallowed whole by the lake's shimmering depths. The silence that followed was deafening. Eyes wide with disbelief, the villagers stared at the empty spot where Tom had stood moments before. The ripples on the water's surface slowly settling as if nothing had happened. But the horror was undeniable. Elias's breath caught in his throat. The memories surged, his brother Jonas, lost to the same lake's reflection, the pain still raw and fresh in his mind. This was no accident, no natural phenomenon. Something dark and malevolent was awakening beneath the moon's descending light. Panic erupted. The crowd buzzed with frantic whispers, some crying out for help, others frozen in terror. Sheriff Caltain pushed through the mob, his gruff voice booming over the chaos. Everyone, calm down. There's no need to jump to conclusions. We'll find Tom. But even Caltain's authoritative tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He glanced nervously at the lake, unwilling to meet Elias's steady, haunted gaze. Elias stepped forward, voice low but resolute. This isn't just the moon playing tricks. I'll find out what's happening and stop it before more people vanish. The villagers looked to him, some with hope, others with fear. The fragile peace shattered, replaced by a growing suspicion that the lake and the moon held secrets darker than anyone dared imagine. As night deepened and the moon sank ever lower, Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. The nightmare was only beginning. The docks emptied slowly, the crowd dispersing into uneasy whispers and hurried steps. Elias lingered, eyes locked on the lake's shimmering surface, the reflection of the moon twisting and pulsing like a living thing. He knew that beneath that hypnotic glow lay a darkness that threatened not only the village, but the fragile thread of his own sanity. He turned away at last, the weight of what was to come pressing heavily on him. Tomorrow he would begin his search. Tonight the moon had claimed its first victim, and Glimmerhollow would never be the same again. Yet in the depths of the lake, where light and shadow danced in unnatural union, something stirred, waiting, watching, hungry for more. Elias's journey into the heart of the lake's dark mystery had begun, and the boundary between reality and nightmare was dissolving with every sinking moment of the moon. The air was heavy with an unseasonable chill, the moon's sickly glow seeping through the skeletal branches above. Night had fully claimed Glimmerhollow, and the village lay silent, save for the occasional cry of a distant loon echoing across the lake. Elias's breath came in shallow puffs, mingling with the cold as he pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame. Each step felt heavier than the last, a physical manifestation of the weight pressing on his mind since the moon began its unsettling descent. The cabin's wooden door creaked open before Elias could knock. Harbin, stooped and wrapped in a patchwork of worn blankets, invited him inside with a nod. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the flickering flame of a lantern and the faint glow of the moon filtering through grimy windows. Shelves groaned under the weight of dusty tomes. Dried herbs hung in clusters, and the scent of damp wood mixed with the faint tang of earth and smoke. "I wondered when you'd come," Harbin rasped, settling into a cracked armchair by the hearth. "There's no time to waste, not with the moon sinking lower each night." Elias nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he took a seat across from the elder. "I need to know, Harbin. What's happening to our village? What is this curse?" Harbin's gaze drifted toward the shadows dancing along the walls. Glimmerhollow's roots run deeper than most care to remember. Long ago, when the village was nothing but a scattering of huts and fishing boats, the founders struck a bargain with forces beyond our reckoning. He leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to swallow the space between them. "The moon, you see, has always been more than just a light in the sky. It's a gate, a beacon for things that lurk beneath the surface, both water and soul." The elders knew this, but hunger and desperation led them to awaken a power best left undisturbed. Elias swallowed hard, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. What kind of power? "A force tied to the lake itself," Harbin said, his eyes darkening. "An entity born from lunar madness, fed by the souls of those it claims. It waits, patient and eternal, for the moon to kiss the water so it may rise." The fire crackled as the old man's words sank into Elias's bones. Outside, the lake lay still, a perfect mirror for the hellish glow of the descending moon. The surface rippled faintly, as if something just beneath it stirred. "And the disappearances?" Elias asked, voice tight. "The entity's hunger grows with the moon's descent. It reaches out, pulling at the threads of our minds, our fears. Those it claims vanish into its reflection, trapped between worlds." Harbin reached under the table and unfolded a weathered map, its edges frayed and stained. He pointed to several faded symbols marked around the village and the lake's perimeter. "These sites," he explained, "are where the veil thins. The elders once performed rituals here, hoping to control the curse. But such things never stay bound." Elias traced the lines with a trembling finger, the cold sweat on his palm betraying his resolve. "Why, tell me this now." Because you're the one who will face it, Harbin replied, voice steady despite his frailty. You've lost much already. The village's fate may rest on your shoulders. A sudden gust rattled the cabin's windows, and the lantern flickered violently. Ilias's gaze snapped to the looming moon visible through the pane, closer, larger, more menacing than ever before. It's coming, Harbin said, eyes locked on the celestial orb. The descent is nearly complete. We must prepare. The room was thick with tension. The ancient curse no longer a distant tale, but a living nightmare clawing at the edges of reality. Elias clenched his fists, the old pain of loss mixing with a new, fierce determination. Then I won't let it consume us, he said quietly, not without a fight. Harbin gave a slow nod, a glimmer of hope flickering in his depths. Good, because once the moon eats the lake, there may be no coming back. Outside, the lake's surface shimmered with the moon's hypnotic glow, the boundary between water and sky blurring beneath the weight of the ancient curse. Elias stepped back into the night, carrying the burden of history and the fragile hope of salvation. As he walked away from the cabin, the wind whispered through the trees like a mournful wail, and the moon sank ever lower, a silent promise of the horrors yet to come. The echoes of the past had awakened, and with them, a darkness that would test the limits of sanity and survival in glimmers. Elias Marrow stood near the water's edge, his gaze fixed on the rippling surface where the moon's reflection danced and shimmered with a strange, unnatural light. The usual peaceful lapping of the lake was now underscored by a subtle, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat beneath the water that set his nerves on edge. He was not alone. Mara Lorne approached quietly, her footsteps muffled against the damp earth, her tall frame silhouetted against the fading light. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, revealing sharp features etched with worry. Elias turned to her, sensing the weight of what she carried within. Elias, Mara began, her voice low but urgent. I saw him again today, Jonas. Elias's breath caught. Where? In the lake's reflection. Not just a reflection, something else. A place beyond the surface. I reached out, and he reached back. But he's trapped. He's stuck there, caught between worlds. The words settled over Elias like a cold wave. He had heard whispers of such liminal spaces before, but hearing it from Mara, the village herbalist, the keeper of law, made it painfully real. You're sure? She nodded, eyes glistening. He's not gone, not entirely. But the longer he stays, the harder it becomes to bring him back. The moonit's pulling him in, pulling us all in. Elias clenched his fists, the old ache of loss gnawing at him. The lake had always been a place of solace. Now it was a prison, a trap shaped by the moon's eerie descent. Across the village, the symptoms of lunar madness were spreading. Villagers, once vibrant and steady, now stumbled through their days like sleepwalkers, eyes clouded with a haunted glaze. Some muttered of voices beneath the water, commands whispered in a tongue that twisted their minds. Others saw things, distorted faces in the shadows, hands reaching up from the depths. Panic simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. In the tavern, an older woman suddenly convulsed, her body writhing on the floor as she babbled incoherently about the moon's embrace. Elias and Mara rushed to her side, but her eyes remained fixed on the window, where the moon hung impossibly low, its light bleeding across the lake. It's coming, she whispered. It's coming for us all. Sheriff Caltain, ever the pragmatist, was less willing to entertain such fears. He met Ilias's growing concern with gruff dismissal. People are scared, he said, pacing in his cramped office. That's all this is. Fear makes folks see things. This isn't just fear, Elias insisted. Something's wrong. The moon, the lake. It's changing people. Carlton's eyes narrowed. You're chasing ghosts, Marrow. It's dangerous, stirring up panic. But even the sheriff couldn't ignore the reports piling up. Missing villagers, strange sightings, and the pervasive aura of dread that settled over Glimmer Hollow like a shroud. That night, Elias found himself drawn once again to the lake. The moon's reflection swayed hypnotically, casting ripples of light that seemed almost alive. A sudden shiver ran down his spine as a shadow flickered across the surface, a shape, shifting and fluid, like a face contorted by pain and madness. He blinked, but the vision remained, haunting his gaze. Behind him, Mara's voice was barely a whisper. It's watching us, waiting. Elias swallowed hard. The boundary between reality and nightmare was thinning, and the villagers fattaned his own hung precariously in the balance. We have to find a way to stop it, he said, voice steady despite the fear clawing at him, before it's too late. A cold wind swept across the water, carrying with it the faintest of whispers, half-remembered songs of the moon and the lake, of souls lost and darkness growing. As the night deepened, so did the madness, and the moon sank ever lower, closer to the water's hungry embrace. The air was thick with the chill of early autumn, a biting cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. The moon hung low, swollen and unnaturally bright, its silver glow casting long, wavering shadows that danced upon the restless surface of the water. Ripples, subtle but unsettling, traced across the lake as if disturbed by some unseen hand beneath. Ilias's breath came in shallow bursts, forming fragile clouds that dissolved quickly into the darkening air. His eyes narrowed, searching the mirrored depths for answers that refused to come. Night after night, the moon sank closer, and with it came a creeping unease that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The lake's hypnotic shimmer tugged at his mind, whispering secrets he was desperate to deny. He turned away from the water and made his way back to his cabin. The familiar creak of the wooden dock underfoot the only sound to accompany his heavy footsteps. Inside, the dim glow of a single candle flickered against walls cluttered with fishing nets, weathered tools, and worn photographs. Elias moved stiffly, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him as memories began to rise unbidden. His fingers trembled as they brushed over a faded photograph of his late wife, her smile frozen in time but always just out of reach. The loss that had shattered his world clawed at his heart anew, mingling with the dread that now gripped the village. He had wrestled with grief for years, but tonight it felt sharper, more suffocating, as if the moon's descent had awakened something darker within him. A sudden noise snapped his attention to the window. A distant, mournful cry echoed across the lake. Ilias's heart pounded, the sound reverberating through his chest like a warning. He swallowed hard, steadying his breath, but the unease lingered. The line between past and present blurred. The shadows in his cabin seemed to shift and lengthen, teasing the edges of his vision. The next evening found Elias in the village tavern, a cramped, dimly lit room filled with the low murmur of anxious voices. Mara Lorne sat across from him, her sharp green eyes reflecting both determination and fear. Sheriff Caltaine leaned against the bar, his stocky frame, rigid jaw clenched tight beneath his gruff exterior. The atmosphere was taut, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "You're chasing ghosts, Elias," the sheriff said, voice low and steady, but edged with frustration. "This is a village, not some cursed fairy tale. People vanish here, that's terrifying, but we need facts, not superstition." Mara's gaze flared. And what about the shimmering reflections? The way the moon's light pulls at the lake like a living thing. You saw what happened to Jonas. We can't just pretend. Ilias's voice cracked as he spoke, haunted by the gulf of loss that separated him from his younger brother. It's not just superstition. Something's wrong here. The moon is changing us, fracturing our minds. The sheriff's skepticism clashed with Mara's urgency, and Elias felt caught between their worlds. Fear and paranoia rippled through the villages, dividing them into uneasy factions. Some clung to reason, others to desperate belief. And Elias, caught in the storm of his own unraveling, wondered how much longer he could hold on to the fragile thread of reality. That night, sleep eluded him. When it finally came, it brought no relief. Instead, it dragged him into a labyrinth of nightmares where the moon sank into the lake, swallowing light and hope whole. He found himself drowning beneath the surface, water cold and suffocating. Shadows twisting into faces he could not place, some familiar, some monstrous. The lake whispered promises of oblivion, its depths alive with the echoes of lost souls. He woke with a gasp, heart hammering wildly, sweat chilling on his skin despite the cold night air. For a moment, the line between dream and waking blurred. The candle flickered as if caught in a breeze, though the room was still. Elias pressed his hands to the rough wooden table, grounding himself against the tide of madness rising within. Outside, the moon hung low once more, its glow spilling silver light through the window, casting strange patterns on the floor. Elias knew this was no ordinary night. The lake's call was growing stronger, and with it, the danger threatening to consume Glimmerhollow and himself. He clenched his fists, the determination hardening in his chest. He could not afford to fall apart. Not now, not when the village needed him most. But as the shadows lengthened and the moon sank ever lower, Elias, Marrow felt the fragile walls of his mind beginning to crack, threatening to shatter completely under the weight of lunar madness and aquatic dread. The fractured minds of Glimmerhollow were a warning, a whisper of the darkness to come. Elias would have to confront not only the horrors lurking beneath the lake's surface, but the demons within himself. The night was deepening, and with it, the nightmare was only beginning. As dawn threatened the horizon, Elias stood once more by the lake, the hypnotic glow of the moon reflecting in his weary eyes. Somewhere in the depths, something waited, and Elias knew that soon he would have to face it before the moon devoured them all. But would his mind hold long enough to fight? Or would the shadows claim him first? The lake was watching, the moon was sinking, and the fracture was growing. Elias swallowed hard, the taste of salt and fear heavy on his tongue. The night was far from over. Mara knelt on the muddy shore, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the water's trembling surface. The faint glow of the moon shimmered across the ripples, painting the lake in silver and shadow. Somewhere beneath that shifting light was Jonas, her brother, trapped in a place not meant for the living. She reached out, hesitant, as if the water might swallow her whole if she dared to touch it. But beneath the surface, the reflection wavered, and Jonas's face appeared, pale and blurred, like a candle flickering in a dark room. His eyes, wide and unblinking, locked with hers. He was there, yet unreachable, a ghost imprisoned by the moon's eerie embrace. "Jonas," Mara whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I'm here. I'll find a way to bring you back." Behind her, footsteps crunched on the gravel, and Elias's weathered figure emerged from the shadowed trees. His deep-set eyes, usually so guarded, shone with an intensity born of sleepless nights and haunted memories. "You saw him," Elias said quietly, not as a question but a confirmation. I know, Mara nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. He's trapped in the reflection. Not just lost, trapped. They moved to the dock where the water stretched out like a black glass beneath the moon's fading light. The air was thick with cold and silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against weathered wood. It's more than just a reflection, Elias murmured, his voice low. It's a doorway. Mara's gaze was fixed on the water. A liminal space, she said, the words tasting strange but true. Somewhere between here and whatever this place Jonas is trapped in. Elias reached down, skimming his fingers over the water's surface. The lake pulsed beneath his touch, alive in a way that defied reason. The moonlight fractured and twisted, shadows writhing like smoke caught in a sudden gust. Suddenly, the water rippled violently. Jonas's blurred form flickered like a flame on the edge of extinguishment. His mouth opened silently, mouthing words that Mara couldn't hear but felt deep in her bones, a warning, a plea. "We don't have much time," Elias said grimly. "The longer they're in there, the harder it is to pull them back." Mara swallowed hard. "What is this place? What is that thing?" Elias stared into the depths, the moon's glow casting a pale light across his weathered face. "It's the lunar entity. It's feeding off them, pulling them into its world, and it's growing stronger with every soul it consumes." The lake seemed to breathe around them, the boundary between water and sky blurring as the moon sank lower, its reflection stretching and distorting. The air was thick with a cold dread, the kind that settled into the bones and refused to leave. "We have to fight it," Mara said, gripping Elias's arm. "For Jonas, for everyone." Elias nodded, though the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily upon him. But how? As the moon's silver light waned, the lake's surface shimmered with a dark hunger, and the reflection's grip tightened. Somewhere beneath that shifting light, the line between reality and nightmare thinned, and the fight for Glimmerhollow's soul had only just begun. The night stretched on, filled with whispers, carried on the wind and the distant, haunting echo of a trapped voice beneath the waves. Mara and Elias stood side by side, their resolve hardening against the coming storm. The reflection's grip was tightening, but so was their determination. And in the heart of the lake's dark embrace, the first true battle against the lunar madness was about to begin. The surface of the lake rippled again, and in that moment, the moon seemed to pulse with a terrible life of its own, as if drawing them all deeper into its cold, unyielding embrace. The question lingered in the chill night air. Could they break the reflection's grip before it was too late? Or would Glimmerhollow be swallowed whole by the moon's insatiable hunger? And as the moon sank ever lower, the boundary between water and sky, sanity and madness, life and oblivion grew thinner still. Shadows danced erratically across the cracked wooden walls, mirroring the unease that had settled over Glimmerhollow like a suffocating fog. Sheriff Cultain stood rigid behind the battered oak desk, his broad shoulders squared as if bracing against a storm, while Elias, Marrow, and Mara Lorne faced him, their eyes alight with urgency. "Sheriff," Elias began, voice low but steady, "you can't dismiss what's happening. People are vanishing, drawn into that cursed reflection on the lake. I've seen it with my own eyes." Calton's face tightened, a deep crease forming between his brows. "Elias, I've been the sheriff here longer than you've been alive. I know when folks are spooked by the unknown, but fear doesn't make things disappear. There's got to be a logical explanation." Mara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "My brother's gone, Cultain, vanished into that shimmering surface. You want logic? Then explain that." The sheriff's gaze flicked to Mara, then back to Elias, his skepticism palpable. Stories and legends won't save us. We need facts, not ghost tales. Elias clenched his fists, the memory of his lost wife and the drowning of his younger brother tightening his throat. This isn't just stories, this is real. I've seen the ripples in the water distort like something alive beneath the surface. The moon's coming closer every night, and it's changing the lake, changing us. Calton's eyes narrowed. You're talking lunacy, Elias. You're losing grip on what's real. The room's heavy silence was broken by a sudden commotion outside the hall. A villager burst through the door, breathless, eyes wide with terror. I saw it, a man gone into the lake's reflection. Murmurs erupted, voices overlapping in panic and disbelief. Caltain raised his hands, trying to regain control. Enough. We'll investigate this calmly. No more hysteria. But the damage was done. The villagers were splitting into factions. Those who believed the lake held a malevolent force, and those who clung desperately to reason. Outside, the moon hung lower than ever, its pale light casting a hypnotic glow across the restless waters. The lake seemed alive, breathing in sync with the rising dread that gripped the village. Elias and Mara exchanged a grim look. They knew the battle for Glimmerhollow's soul was only beginning, and with the sheriff's resistance, the path ahead would be fraught with suspicion, fear, and the creeping madness of the moon's descent. As the crowd dispersed, whispered warnings and fearful glances toward the lake became the night's soundtrack. The villagers were no longer united by awe, but divided by terror. The reflection on the water was no longer a beautiful spectacle, it was a doorway to oblivion. Elias's gaze lingered on the moon's shimmering face, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Somewhere beneath that silver glow lay the answers, and the darkness waiting to consume them all. "We have to be ready," Mara whispered, gripping his arm. "This is far from over." He nodded, the chill of the night sinking deep into his bones. No one's safe anymore. Not from the lake. Not from the moon. And as the moon continued its slow, ominous descent, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred irrevocably, pulling Glimmerhollow toward a fate it could neither escape nor fully understand. The tension between Elias, Mara, and Sheriff Caltain was a powder keg on the verge of explosion. The sheriff's determination to cling to rationality was both a shield and a barrier, preventing the village from confronting the terrifying truth. Meanwhile, the growing divide among the villagers sowed distrust and fear, fracturing the community's fragile sense of security. Elias's frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior. Each skeptic's dismissal felt like a blow to the very hope he clung to. Mara's fierce resolve, however, was a beacon. Her knowledge of the village's hidden past and her personal loss fueling their quest. Their confrontation in the village hall was more than a clash of opinions. It was a battle for the soul of Glimmerhollow itself. And as the moon's reflection rippled ominously on the lake's surface, the true horror of what lay beneath was only beginning to reveal itself. The night stretched on, thick with unease and whispered fears. Somewhere in the darkness, the lunar entity watched and waited, its hunger growing with each passing moment. And the villagers, caught between disbelief and dread, faced a chilling question: how long before the moon ate the lake and everything within it? The answer hung in the cold night air, as heavy and unstoppable as the moon's slow, inexorable descent. The moon hung low, impossibly close, its pale light casting a sickly glow that shimmered on the lake's glassy surface. Elias gripped the oars, muscles taut, as the boat creaked and groaned beneath him. The village of Glimmerhollow had been cloaked in a strange, unsettling aura ever since the moon began its descent. But tonight, the weight of that dread pressed down harder than ever. He paused mid-stroke, eyes fixed on the luminous orb above, its reflection fracturing and twisting in the water beneath him. It was as if the lake itself breathed a living, pulsing entity harboring secrets darker than the night. Elias's heart hammered in his chest, a primal drumbeat echoing the rising tide of fear. Yet, he had to know. The disappearances, the madness spreading like wildfire, he needed answers, no matter the cost. The boat drifted deeper into the lake's heart, the familiar shoreline vanishing into shadows. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Elias's breath came shallow, misting in the chill. Beneath him, the water pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, ripples spreading in silent waves that seemed to defy the wind. Suddenly, a flicker beneath the surface caught his eye. Shapes moved, fluid and elusive like shadows cast by a flame. Elias leaned forward, peering into the depths. Faces emerged, pale and distorted, their eyes hollow yet burning with a desperate intensity. They twisted and writhed in the watery darkness, mouths opening and closing soundlessly, sending shivers crawling down his spine. A whisper brushed his ear, so faint he thought it might be the wind. "Elias." The voice was fragile, desperate, a thread pulling at his sanity. He spun around, heart racing, but the lake was empty save for the moon's ghostly reflection. His grip tightened on the oars as the ripples around the boat began to pulse, glowing faintly with an eerie light. The lunar entity was here no longer just a shadowy rumor, but a tangible presence, alive in the water and sky. Its form shifted like liquid silver, casting flickering shapes that danced between nightmare and reality. Elias felt the weight of its gaze, cold and infinite, probing the depths of his mind, stirring the darkest memories he had tried to bury. Memories of Loss's wife, his brother, Jonas flooded him, mingling with the moon's hypnotic pull. The boundary between self and shadow blurred as the entity's influence seeped into his thoughts. Yet amidst the terror, a steely resolve ignited within him. He would not let this malevolent force consume his village, nor his soul. With a sudden, determined thrust, Elias seized the oars and began to row back toward the shore. The lake fought back, waves rising in unnatural swells that rocked the boat and threatened to swallow him whole. But he pressed on, the flickering light of the moon's reflection chasing him like a predator. As the shoreline re-emerged through the mist, Elias cast one last glance over his shoulder. The lunar entity's form lingered beneath the water, a monstrous reflection of the moon's descent, promising that the battle was only just beginning. The night had revealed its horrors, but also the path forward. Elias knew the lake held more secrets than ever before, and the moon's eerie glow was a beacon guiding him into deeper darkness. The question that haunted him now was not whether he could face the entity, but whether he could survive the cost of doing so. The night swallowed the boat's wake, leaving only silence and the fading shimmer of the moon's reflection. The moon's descent was no longer a distant mystery, but a living nightmare woven into the fabric of Glimmerhollow. Elias's solitary journey onto the lake had unveiled a terrifying truth: that the lunar entity was more than a curse, was a ravenous force hungry for souls. And it had marked him as its next adversary. The chill of the night lingered, a cold reminder that the lake's depths were far darker than anyone dared imagine. Yet somewhere beneath the dread, a fragile flame of hope flickered. Elias would return. He would fight for the village, for Mara's brother trapped beyond the reflection, for the fragile boundary between sanity and oblivion. But as the moon sank ever lower, the sky itself seemed to fade, and the lake waited patiently to claim its due. The moon hung heavy and low, its silvery light diffusing through the mist like a spectral lantern, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with the restless breeze. Around them, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual nocturnal chorus muted as if the very woods were wary of what had awakened beneath the lake's glassy surface. Ilias's eyes, sharp despite the weariness etched deep into his face, darted across the darkened underbrush. Each step forward was measured, his fishing knife gripped tightly in one hand, the other brushing against the rough bark of a tree for balance. Beside him, Mara's breaths came quicker, her gaze flickering nervously between the oppressive shadows and the shimmering moon above. Her green eyes, usually so fierce and inquisitive, were now wide with a cocktail of fear and determination. "Did you hear that?" Mara whispered, halting and cocking her head, her voice barely above the rustle of leaves. Ilias nodded slowly, whispers, like the lake's calling a saw, warning us. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of indistinct murmurs that seemed to crawl under their skin, twisting their thoughts with icy fingers. The moonlight reflected off the water's edge, where ripples shimmered unnaturally, distorting the familiar outlines of reeds and rocks into grotesque shapes. It was then that the first figure emerged. From the shadows of the village square, a woman stepped into view, her movements jerky and disjointed, as if her limbs obeyed some unseen puppeteer. Her eyes glowed faintly silver, the pupils dilated into formless orbs that reflected the moon's eerie light. Her mouth opened in a silent scream that twisted into a guttural growl, and from the depths of her throat came a sound that was no longer human. Ilias instinctively raised his knife, stepping in front of Mara as more figures staggered into the clearing. The villagers, or what was left of them, were contorted into unnatural postures, their faces stretched and distorted, shadows seeming to crawl beneath their skin. The lunar entity had claimed them, animating their bodies as vessels for its dark will. "Run," Ilias barked, grabbing Mara's arm as one of the possessed lunged forward with unnatural speed. The wet slap of footsteps on mud echoed through the silent night, punctuated by the ragged gasps of breath and the crunch of broken branches. They sprinted toward the edge of the village, hearts pounding in their chests, the nightmare chasing them relentlessly. Mara stumbled, but Ilias caught her, pulling her back to her feet. The moon's reflection shimmered on the lake beside them, a gateway to madness and oblivion. Breathless and desperate, they found refuge in an old cabin, its wooden walls cracked and weathered by time. The moonlight filtered through the broken window panes, casting fractured patterns of light and shadow that seemed to flicker with a life of their own. "This isn't just some curse," Mara said, voice trembling. "It's a hunger. It feeds on us and our fear, our memories." Ilias nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. "And it's only just begun." Outside, the possessed villagers gathered, their distorted forms silhouetted against the moonlit lake, waiting, watching. The line between the living and the damned blurred beneath the sinking moon, and the night stretched on, heavy with the promise of horrors yet to come. As dawn threatened the horizon, Ilias and Mara exchanged a glance filled with unspoken resolve. Whatever lay beneath the lake's depths, whatever malevolent force had awakened with the moon's descent, they would face it together, or not at all. But as the first light kissed the water's surface, a chilling thought settled in Ilias's mind. How long before the shadows claimed them to? The night was far from over. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, the kind that clings to old wood and secrets long hidden beneath the surface. Elias Marrow sat stiffly at the rough-hewn table, his knuckles pale as he gripped the edge, eyes fixed on the weathered face of Old Man Harbin. The old man's pale blue eyes gleamed with a strange mixture of weariness and urgency. His breath shallow, as if each word he spoke cost him something precious. "You want to know the truth, Elias," Harbin began, his voice a low rasp. "The truth that's been buried with the dead and drowned in the lake's depths." Elias nodded slowly, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. He had guessed the village's troubles ran deeper than superstition and lunar madness, but hearing it spoken aloud was another matter entirely. Harbin reached beneath the table and pulled out a bundle of brittle parchment tied with a faded ribbon. He placed it gently before Elias, the edges curling like the leaves of a long-forgotten tome. "These are the records of the elders," he said, "the ones who made the pact with the moon itself." Elias's fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the first sheet, faded ink revealing sketches of strange symbols. Lunar phases intertwined with aquatic imagery, fish, waves, and a crescent moon sinking into a pool of black water. "The elders," Harbin continued, "once sought to protect Glimmer Hollow from the harshness of the world beyond. They believed that by binding themselves to the moon's power, they could ensure the village's safety and prosperity. They crafted a ritual, whispered in the dead of night, beneath the fullest moon, upon the shore of the lake." The old man paused, eyes distant, but the power they summoned was not meant for mortal hands. It was ancient, hungry, and it twisted the pact into a curse. Elias's mind reeled. The villagers' disappearances, the madness spreading like wildfire, they were all symptoms of a legacy written long before his time. The knowledge was a double-edged blade, offering a path to understanding while threatening to sever his hope. "Why, tell me this now?" Elias asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Harbin said, "the curse is awakening again, and the elders' time has passed. It falls to you now to face the darkness they unleashed. You must understand the nature of the entity feeding on our souls, or we are all doomed." Elias looked out the small window, where the moon's reflection shimmered on the lake's surface, a deceptive beauty masking a malevolent hunger. The night was alive with whispers, the wind, the water, the fading sky above. He clenched his fists, the weight of the village's fate pressing down like the cold night air. "Tell me everything," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." As Harbin delved deeper into the history of Glimmer Hollow's secret past, Elias listened intently, absorbing the grim tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and the desperate hope that had led the elders to gamble with forces beyond their control. The story was a tapestry woven with fear and regret, a cautionary tale etched into the very bones of the village. Outside, the lake murmured softly, the moon's glow stretching like a finger reaching for the depths. Elias felt the creeping pull of the lunar madness, but beneath it, a spark of resolve flickered to life. The fight was no longer just for survival. It was a battle for the soul of Glimmer Hollow itself. When the revelations finally ceased, the two men sat in silence, the heavy truth settling between them like the night's chill. Elias knew the path ahead would be perilous, that the line between reality and nightmare would blur beyond recognition. But armed with the knowledge of the Elders' Pact and the curse's origins, he felt, for the first time in weeks, that he had a chance to confront the terror lurking beneath the lake. He stood, the candlelight casting long shadows on the cabin walls. "Thank you, Harbin. We have work to do." The old man nodded solemnly. "May the moon watch over you, Elias. But beware, the moon's light can be as deadly as its darkness." Stepping out into the biting night, Elias inhaled the sharp air, the moon's eerie glow bathing the village in silver. The lake mirrored the sky's fading light, a liquid abyss that promised salvation or oblivion. As he gazed into the reflection, a shiver ran down his spine, a warning and a challenge. The secrets in the dark were no longer secrets. Now, the true battle began. The moon, swollen and luminous, had sunk ever closer to the lake's glassy surface, its silver light casting a hypnotic sheen that flickered with unnatural life. Shadows stretched and warped unnervingly under its glow, and the villagers whispered with mounting fear as the boundary between the real and the unreal thinned perilously. At the edge of the village, a man stumbled through the lacing underbrush of the forest path, his breath ragged in the cold night air. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat echoing like a warning drum. Behind him, the dim lights of Glimmer Hollow flickered uncertainly, the sounds of distant voices and hurried footsteps growing faint. Ahead, the lake's surface shimmered, the moon's reflection rippling with a sinister allure that seemed to reach out like fingers of liquid light. The man's eyes darted wildly as he fought the magnetic pull of that otherworldly glow. He was one of the last to resist the creeping madness, but the terror inside him had clawed free. Desperation drove his legs forward, away from the village, away from the sinking moon. Yet the lake's reflection beckoned irresistibly. His skin prickled with cold sweat, and his mind teetered on the edge of comprehension and chaos. The air thrummed with an eerie vibration, a low hum rising from the water that set his teeth on edge. Behind him, footsteps raced through the village streets. Elias, Marrow, and Mara Lorne pushed through the crowd, voices terse and breathless in the night. They caught sight of Sheriff Caltone, standing rigid and watchful at the village boundary, his gruff face pale beneath the moonlight. "He can't just run off into the night," Elias urged, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to stop him before whatever's out there gets to him." Calton's eyes narrowed, skepticism battling with a growing unease. "We don't know what we're dealing with yet. Panic won't help anyone." "Panic?" Mara's sharp tone cut through the tension. "We've seen what the moon's doing. People are disappearing. You saw it yourself." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "I'm trying to keep order, not fan the flames of hysteria." The argument was interrupted by a sudden, unnatural ripple that shattered the lake's reflection like glass fracturing under pressure. The villager reached the water's edge just as the shimmering surface twisted and convulsed. His form blurred, distorted, caught between worlds as the moonlight danced malevolently. A strangled cry escaped his lips, swallowed quickly by the night. His body was drawn forward, fluid and relentless, as the lake claimed him, the water swallowing the desperate man whole. Gasps and screams erupted from the few witnesses left behind. The village was thrown into chaos. Elias's heart hammered painfully as the reality of the loss sank in. This was no longer a story of wonder or superstition. This was a nightmare unfolding in real time. As the moon's descent continued, the sky seemed to darken unnaturally, stars dimming beneath the lunar glow. Lights flickered in windows, shadows stretched and writhed along the walls of homes, and the air grew thick with an oppressive dread that seeped into every corner of Glimmer Hollow. Elias stood by the lake, his gaze locked on the sinking moon and its fractured reflection. His mind battled the rising madness, clawing at his thoughts. The fragile line between sanity and oblivion thinned to a razor's edge. "We have to fight this," he whispered to the void, the words barely audible over the low hum of the water. "We can't let it consume us all." Mara joined him, her green eyes fierce with determination despite the fear lurking beneath. Together, they faced the darkening night and the monstrous presence beneath the lake that threatened to drown their world in lunacy and shadow. This night marked the breaking point, not just for the fleeing villager, whose life was stolen by the lunar reflection. But for all of Glimmer Hollow, the battle against the encroaching darkness was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it demanded a reckoning. And as the moon sank ever lower, the nightmare only deepened. Its silvery light spilled like molten metal, trembling across the lake's surface in restless waves. He could almost feel the weight of it pressing down, an unnatural heaviness that seemed to warp the very air around him. The village of Glimmer Hollow lay behind him, its darkened rooftops swallowed by shadows. But his gaze was fixed on the luminous orb sinking closer with each passing moment. The reflection in the water flickered, not like a calm mirror image, but as if the surface was alive, breathing and shifting with a sinister pulse. Elias's heart thudded painfully in his chest as the edges of the moon's glow bled into the water, bleeding into the sky, as if the boundary was dissolving. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the madness creeping into his vision, but it only deepened. Shapes formed beneath the shimmering light faces, distorted and fluid, their hollow eyes begging for release or warning of doom. A sudden gust of wind stirred the reeds at his feet, whispering secrets he could almost understand. The lake's surface rippled, sending tiny waves lapping at the shore, each one carrying a faint, haunting melody that tugged at his mind. Elias swallowed hard, the memories of his wife's loss flashing behind his eyes, mingling with the growing fear that this night would bring more than just sorrow. Farther down the shore, a faint glow emanated from Mara Lawn's cabin. Drawn by the flickering light, Elias made his way there, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoing in the quiet night. Mara awaited him inside, her sharp green eyes scanning a worn leather-bound book spread on the wooden table. The faint scent of herbs mingled with the smoke from a single candle, shadows dancing across the walls. "Elias," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tension that gripped them both. "I found something." He leaned over the tome, tracing the faded script with a trembling finger. The pages spoke of an ancient ritual, one tied to the cycles of the moon and the lake's depths. A ceremony meant to sever the bond between the celestial and the earthly, to banish the curse that had haunted Glimmer Hollow since its founding. "It's risky," Mara warned, "but it might be our only chance to stop this madness before it consumes us all." Elias nodded grimly. "Then we don't have time to waste." As Mara carefully outlined the ritual's steps, Elias felt a shudder ripple through his body. His mind reeled, visions invading his senses with increasing ferocity. He saw the moon no longer distant and serene, but a monstrous, sinking eye swallowing the lake whole. Its light flooded the village, turning the familiar streets into rivers of silver. Homes submerged beneath the tide. Faces appeared in the water, twisted in silent screams, reaching out to him, begging for salvation and revenge. He staggered back, clutching his head as the hallucinations surged. The boundary between reality and nightmare blurred, the whispers from the lake growing louder, promising oblivion. "Elias," Mara's voice cut through the haze. "Focus. We can fight this." He forced himself to breathe, the cold night air grounding him, if only for a moment. Outside, the sky darkened unnaturally, thick clouds swirling in ominous patterns. A low, haunting hum rose from the lake's depths, a vibration felt in the bones, resonating with the pulse of the moon. The village was holding its breath, teetering on the edge of oblivion. Elias and Mara exchanged a determined glance. The battle for Glimmer Hollow was far from over, but for the first time there was a glimmer of hope amidst the encroaching darkness. The fading sky whispered of promises and terror alike, and the lake waited hungry, patient, and merciless. As Elias looked back toward the water's edge, The moon's reflection shimmered, beckoning once more. He tightened his grip on Mara's hand, steeling himself for the trials to come. "We begin at dawn," he said, voice steady despite the storm inside. And beneath the fading sky, the nightmare deepened. The air was thick with tension as Elias and Mara prepared for the ancient ritual that might sever the lunar entity's hold. Old Man Harbin, though frail, had offered his knowledge and guidance, a flicker of the village's buried past rising to meet its present peril. The clock was ticking. The moon was sinking ever lower, the boundary between sky and water blurring with every passing hour. Elias felt the weight of the village's fate pressing down on him. But beneath it all, a stubborn flame of determination burned. The moon might eat the lake, but he would not let it consume Glimmer Hollow without a fight. The night was far from over. Sheriff Caltaine stepped cautiously onto the weather-beaten pier, his boots echoing softly against the planks slick with dew. The moon loomed low and swollen above the lake, its pale light shimmering with unnatural clarity on the water's surface. It was unlike any lunar glow he had ever seen, too vibrant, too close, as if the moon itself might slip from the sky and drown in the lake's cold embrace. Caltaine's breath formed ragged clouds in the chill air as he scanned the rippling reflection. His fingers tightened around the grip of his flashlight, its beam slicing through the fog to reveal distorted shapes beneath the water. The villagers' whispered fears had seemed like superstition, wild stories born from grief and panic. But tonight, something gnawed at the edge of his skepticism. A sudden flicker caught his Aja shadow, not cast by any physical form, writhing and twisting beneath the surface like a living nightmare. The water roiled as if breathing, and a faint, almost imperceptible whispering drifted to his ears, a chorus of voices speaking in a language older than the village itself. Caltaine's heart pounded fiercely. His hands slipped from the flashlight to clutch the cold railing, knuckles whitening. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Across the lake, lanterns flickered in the village square where Elias, Marrow, and Mara Lawn had summoned the remaining villagers. The hall was thick with tension and the scent of burning pine and herbs. Elias's lined face was drawn tight with worry, his deep-set eyes scanning the crowd for signs of hope or despair. Mara stood beside him, her dark hair pulled back, eyes blazing with a fierce determination that belied her fear. "We can't wait for the moon to come crashing down on us," Elias said, his voice steady but urgent. "This is no ordinary celestial event. It's a curse one that's been feeding on us since the village's founding. The lunar entity is real, and it's growing stronger." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some faces pale with dread, others hardening with resolve. Mara stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "We have knowledge, tools, and each other. If we stand divided, the entity will consume us all. But together, we might just survive." Back at the dock, Caltaine's thoughts churned. The evidence was undeniable. Now the strange disappearances, the villagers' madness, the haunting reflections. He had spent years dismissing Ilias's warnings, seeing him as a troubled man haunted by personal loss. But tonight, the veil had been lifted. The supernatural was no longer a tale to be scoffed at. It was a grim reality. Caltaine pulled a small, glistening lake leaf from his pocket, the same type found near the latest disappearance. Its edges shimmered faintly under the moonlight, unnaturally perfect and cold to the touch. The air around him thickened, the whispers growing louder, pressing against his mind like waves. Determined, he made his way toward the village hall, the weight of his newfound knowledge pressing heavy on his shoulders. When he arrived, Elias and Mara greeted him with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. The sheriff's gruff voice broke the silence. "I've seen it. I know it's real." We need to act now. Together, the three formed a fragile alliance, a beacon of hope amid the encroaching darkness. Plans were laid to protect the remaining villages, to confront the entity beneath the lake, and to sever its hold on Glimmer Hollow. Yet beneath their determined faces, a shadow lingered, the knowledge that this confrontation could cost them everything. As the night deepened, Elias and Kaltain stood side by side at the water's edge. The moon's reflection fractured across the lake's surface, shifting and shimmering with a malevolent life of its own. Neither spoke, but in their shared silence was an understanding. The village had reached a crossroads. The old certainties were gone, replaced by a terrifying new reality, and the battle for their souls was about to begin. The chill wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of madness and the promise of a dawn that might never come. The moon hung low and luminous, its descent more pronounced with every passing hour, casting an otherworldly glow that bathed the village of Glimmer Hollow in silver and shadow. The villagers, once filled with wonder and celebration, now stood near the water's edge, like moths drawn to a flame, eyes glazed. Movements slow and unsteady, as if caught in the wake of some irresistible tide. Ilias Maro stood among them, his knuckles white as he gripped the worn wooden post of the old pier. His gaze was locked on the shimmering reflection, the distorted visage of the moon fractured across the restless waves. A cold shiver ran down his spine, not from the chill of the night air, but from the growing sense of something deeply wrong. The lake was no longer a placid expanse of water. It was a threshold, a shifting veil between worlds, and the moon's reflection was its siren call. Beside him, Mara Lawn's sharp green eyes scanned the crowd with mounting urgency. "We don't have much time," she whispered, voice barely audible over the faint lapping of the water. "More are slipping away every hour." Elias nodded grimly, casting a glance toward a young woman who stood at the water's edge, her face pale and expression vacant. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, toes sinking into the moist earth, eyes fixed on the swirling moonlight beneath her feet. Another step, and another. "No," Elias hissed, lunging forward. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but gentle, pulling her back before she could cross the invisible boundary. She blinked, confusion flickering in her eyes, then collapsed into his arms, trembling. "You have to fight it," he urged, voice low but fierce. "The lake isn't safe. The reflection, it's not what you think." The woman's lips quivered, struggling to form words. "It's calling me." "I can't." Elias tightened his hold. "You can. You have to." Mara stepped forward, producing a small vial from her satchel. "This might help," she said urgently. "Herbs to clear the mind, ground you." Reluctantly, the woman accepted, swallowing the bitter liquid as the moonlight flickered above them. Across the pier, Sheriff Kaltain arrived, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. His usual stoic demeanor was cracked by a flicker of uncertainty. "What's going on here?" he barked, eyes darting to the entranced villagers. Elias turned sharply. "The moon's reflection, it's pulling them in. We have to stop it." Kaltain scoffed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his doubt. "Pulling them in, that's superstition. People are just scared." "It's real," Mara said, stepping beside Elias. "I've seen it. Jonas is trapped in that liminal space beneath the reflection." The mention of Ilias's younger brother's name seemed to harden the sheriff's gaze. "We need order," he said firmly. "Chaos won't save anyone." Ilias's eyes narrowed. "Order won't stop the lake from swallowing us whole." Tension crackled between them like static electricity as the villagers continued their slow, hypnotic drift toward the water. The moon's glow intensified, ripples on the lake twisting into shapes, faint whispers of faces, hands reaching, shadows stretching. The lunar entity had grown bolder, its pull more potent. Elias took a deep breath, forcing his trembling hands to steady. "We need to fight it," he said, voice low but resolute. "If we don't, more will be lost." Mara nodded, eyes fierce. "Then we start now." Together, they moved among the villagers, pulling those closest to the water back from the brink. Some resisted, eyes wild with confusion or fear. Others seemed unaware, caught in some trance beyond reach. The struggle was exhausting, both physically and mentally, as the air around them seemed to thicken with unseen menace. At one point, Elias found himself face to face with a man whose features twisted and blurred beneath the moonlight, a grotesque reflection of the entity's power. The man's eyes were black voids, and his voice came as a rasping hiss. "The moon calls," he whispered. "Join us beneath." Elias recoiled, pushing the man away and shouting for help. Mara and Sheriff Keltane rushed over, weapons drawn, though their resolve wavered. The confrontation left Elias shaken but undeterred. The entity was no longer content to lure. Silently it was manifesting through the villagers, spreading its madness like a dark tide. As the night deepened, the wind carried faint, haunting melodies echoes of ancient curses and drowned souls. Elias clenched his jaw, fighting the rising panic within. He could feel the entity's seductive pull tugging at his own mind, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of his sanity. But he would not yield. "Not tonight. We stand together," he murmured, eyes scanning the horizon where the moon hovered dangerously low. "Or we drown alone." The lake's shimmering reflection pulsed in response, a silent challenge beneath the fading sky. And the battle for Glimmer Hollow was just beginning. As dusk crept over Glimmer Hollow, Elias found himself drawn to the water's edge once more. The sinking moon cast a hypnotic glow, its light fractured and mingled with the restless ripples. To any outsider, it would have seemed a tranquil scene, but Elias knew better. The surface shimmered with a restless energy, as if the lake itself breathed beneath the fading sky. He sat on the damp earth, knees drawn close, staring into the depths where reality seemed to blur. The whispers began again, faint yet unmistakable, a susurrus of drowned voices weaving through the rustling reeds and the lapping water. His heart hammered in his chest, an erratic rhythm that echoed the chaos inside him. The faces in the reflection shifted, fleeting and grotesque, as if the moon's light had fractured into 1,000 haunted fragments. His breath caught when a sudden chill ran down his spine. The air thickened, heavy with salt and decay, and the lake's surface rippled unnaturally, distorting the moon's reflection into a writhing, fluid shape. Elias blinked, but the vision held firm, a shifting mass of light and shadow, its edges curling like smoke, faces emerging and dissolving in a maddening dance. The world tilted as a wave of nausea swept over him. Memories disjointed and painful surged forth, the loss of Jonas, the quiet nights when the villagers' laughter seemed distant and hollow. The past and present collided violently, and Elias's grip on himself slipped. Later, in the dim confines of his cabin, the nightmare followed. Shadows clung to the corners, twisting into impossible forms. On the peeling wallpaper, he saw eyes endless, watery, accusing. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting distorted patterns that danced like specters. Elias pressed his hands to his temples, fighting the onslaught of visions that threatened to consume him whole. "You're losing yourself," a voice whispered, cruel and seductive. It was the lake, the moon, the entity, all entwined in a cacophony of torment. Then came Mara's knock, sharp and insistent. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, her green eyes bright with concern. "Elias, you need to come back to yourself," she said firmly, crossing the threshold into his private hell. He looked up at her, wild-eyed and trembling. "It's all slipping away," he confessed, voice cracked and raw. "The lake, the moon. They're inside me now." Mara knelt beside him, taking his hands in hers. Her touch was steady, a lifeline in the storm. "You're not alone," she assured him. "We'll face this together." Her presence was a bomb, a fragile thread tethering Elias to the world he was desperate to hold on to. She shared her own fears, stories of the village's curse and the lurking darkness beneath the water. In that small cabin, amid the shadows and whispered madness, an alliance was forged, one born of desperation and hope. The next night, they met again at the lake, the moon hanging low and swollen in the ink-black sky. The water gleamed unnaturally, alive with shimmering light that seemed to pulse in time with Ilias's ragged breaths. He stood at the edge, Mara beside him, both poised on the precipice of the unknown. A sudden wave of hallucinations crashed over Elias. The faces in the water screamed silently. The moon fractured into 1,000 shards, and the lake's depths seemed to reach out with clawing fingers. He staggered, gripping Mara's arm, struggling to anchor himself. "Hold on," she urged, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You're stronger than this." With effort, Elias forced his mind back from the abyss, eyes blazing with a fierce determination. The madness might claw at his soul, but he would not surrender, not yet. As the moon continued its descent, casting its eerie glow over Glimmer Hollow, Elias and Mara prepared for the battles ahead, both external and within. The boundary between sanity and oblivion had thinned dangerously, and the lake waited, hungry and patient. But together, they would fight to keep the darkness at bay. And somewhere, beneath the shimmering surface, the lunar entity watched, its hunger growing with the fading sky. The night was far from over. Disappearances had become a grim rhythm each night. More souls drawn into the shimmering reflection that haunted the lake's surface, swallowed by a darkness that seemed both liquid and alive. The villagers who remained were frayed, their eyes wide with terror, their voices trembling with disbelief and despair. Elias Marrow stood at the edge of the village square, the chill night air biting through his threadbare coat. Around him, a small cluster of survivors, gathered faces pale and drawn, eyes flickering with the fragile light of hope and fear. Mara Lawn was among them, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her green eyes sharp and unwavering even as the weight of dread pressed down upon them all. "We can't wait for the moon to swallow us whole," Elias said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "We have to fight back together." Murmurs rippled through the group, a mixture of skepticism and desperate agreement. The village had fractured long ago, divided between those who clung to reason and those who saw the supernatural horror for what it was. But now, the line between belief and madness blurred like the moon's reflection on the roiling lake. Mara stepped forward, her voice low but fierce. "My brother is still trapped in that reflection. I won't lose him to this darkness without a fight. Neither will any of you." A tense silence fell, broken only by the distant splash of water, chilling reminder of the entity's reach. Sheriff Calton's heavy footsteps echoed as he approached, his gruff demeanor softened by the weight of recent horrors. "We need order," he said firmly. "Panic will be our undoing. We stick to the plan Elias and Mara lay out, or we're lost." The survivors nodded, a fragile thread of unity forming amid the chaos. Plans were made to patrol the village, to keep watch over the lake's edge, and to gather whatever knowledge could be gleaned from Old Man Harbin's cryptic tales. As the group dispersed into the night, Elias and Mara lingered by the water's edge. The moon hung low, its reflection a distorted dance of light and shadow that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "It's like the lake itself is breathing," Elias muttered, eyes fixed on the shifting surface. "And it's hungry," Mara replied. "We have to be faster, stronger." The wind carried a faint, eerie melody, the haunting call of the lunar entity weaving through the trees and rippling across the water. Elias felt it clawing at his mind, the creeping madness whispering promises of oblivion, but he would not surrender. Not yet. Back in the makeshift refuge, the village's old church transformed into a sanctuary. Candles flickered against the cold stone walls. Survivors huddled close, sharing stories of lost loved ones and whispered prayers for salvation. Mara moved among them, her presence a beacon of strength, while Elias stood watch, the weight of their fate pressing heavily upon him. The village was shadowed, its hope fading like the dying light of the moon. But in the hearts of Elias and Mara burned a fierce determination to resist the darkness, to reclaim their home, and to face the nightmare lurking beneath the reflection. Tonight, the battle for Glimmer Hollow had truly begun. The moon's descent continued, its hypnotic glow casting long, trembling shadows over the village. And somewhere beneath the lake's surface, the lunar entity stirred hungry, patient, and waiting for the final moment to consume all. Elias clenched his fists, staring into the depths. "We will not go quietly," he vowed. The night was far from over, and the village in shadow would soon learn the true meaning of fear. The villagers' celebrations had long since dwindled into uneasy murmurs, and now only the lake's restless lapping whispered secrets in the darkness. Elias adjusted the strap of his diving gear, his hands steady despite the gnawing unease in his chest. Mara checked her flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows like a beacon of fragile hope. "You ready?" Mara's voice was low but firm, a tremor of determination threading through her words. Elias nodded, swallowing down the lump in his throat. "We have to know. We have to see for ourselves what's beneath that reflection." The water was colder than he expected when he slipped beneath the surface, a shock that stole his breath for a moment before he settled into the rhythmic pulse of his breathing. Above him, the distorted glow of the moon fractured against the ripples, a silver eye watching silently. Mara followed close behind, their flashlights piercing the murk, revealing only fleeting shadows and drifting silt. They swam deeper, the lake's weight pressing down, until the faint outline of a cavern mouth appeared, a yawning maw etched into the underwater cliffside. Elias's heart hammered as they entered, the water around them growing still and dark, the light from their torches revealing walls slick with algae that shimmered with an otherworldly bioluminescence. Within the cavern, the walls told a story. Ancient carvings, worn yet unmistakable, spiraled in patterns reminiscent of lunar cycles, crescents, full moons, and half-shadows, interlaced with figures of drowning villagers, faces frozen in silent screams. Elias traced a trembling finger along the stone, his voice barely a whisper. These are the village elders. They made a pact." Mara's green eyes gleamed in the dim light. A pact with what? A sudden current rippled through the cavern, stirring the silt and sending a shiver through their bones. Then, shapes began to shift within the reflection of their flashlights, fluid forms coalescing into faces both human and grotesque, flickering like broken glass. The lunar entity was awakening. Elias swallowed hard, gripping Mara's arm. "We're not alone here." The entity's voice was a chorus of whispers, echoing from the depths, promising oblivion and madness. It was a fusion of light and shadow, a creature born of the moon's curse and the lake's drowning souls, hungry for more. As it advanced, the water thickened with a suffocating dread, and Elias felt the fragile line between reality and nightmare begin to blur. "We have to fight," Mara urged, her voice steady despite the terror. "If we don't, this village is lost." Elias nodded, drawing on every shred of resolve. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a fight for the soul of Glimmerhallow itself. And beneath the fading sky, with the moon sinking ever lower, the darkness awaited them. The water closed in around them as they faced the entity, the cavern alive with ancient power and looming doom. Somewhere beyond the reflection, the village held its breath, waiting for dawn or disaster. Elias's mind raced, haunted by visions and the weight of the curse, but his will burned fierce. Whatever the cost, he would not let the moon eat the lake without a fight. And as the lunar entity's shifting form surged forward, Elias realized this was only the beginning of a deeper descent into madness, into darkness, into the heart of the nightmare itself. The moon hung low, a pale swollen orb pressed against the sky's dark canvas. Its reflection fractured and distorted across the lake's undulating surface. As he sank deeper, the ambient light waned, replaced by an eerie luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with his quickening breath. Shadows danced and writhed beneath the water, shapes shifting with a liquid grace, sometimes human, sometimes monstrous, always unsettling. His fingers grazed the jagged rocks of the cavern entrance, a yawning maw beneath the lake bed where the lunar entity made its lair. The water here felt different, thicker, almost viscous, as if reality itself had begun to unravel. Voices echoed faintly in his ears, whispers that carried both sorrow and menace, a chorus of drowned souls caught in an eternal limbo. Elias clenched his jaw, forcing his gaze forward despite the creeping madness clawing at his mind. The entity awaited, a shifting mass of light and shadow that flickered between faces, frozen in silent screams, and amorphous shapes that twisted like smoke caught in an unseen wind. It was not merely a creature, but a manifestation of the village's deepest fears and curses. Born from ancient rites and the moon's unnatural descent, its presence assaulted Ilios's senses. Memories of loss and regret surged forth, threatening to drown him in despair. He fought to steady himself, reciting the fragments of the ritual Mara had taught him, the incantations whispered by Old Man Harbin, words older than the village itself. Above the water, Mara's voice trembled but grew stronger, her talisman glowing with a faint, pulsing light that seemed to push back the darkness. The lake's surface rippled violently, the boundary between water and sky wavering as if caught in a cosmic struggle. Elias reached out, his hand trembling as it closed around the core of the entity, a swirling vortex of lunar light tangled with shadowy tendrils. The creature lashed out, tendrils wrapping around his limbs, pulling at his sanity with visions of drowning, loss, and endless night. Pain flared as his mind teetered on the brink, but he summoned every ounce of will, every memory of the village and those left behind. With a guttural cry, he wrenched free, driving a shard of fractured moonlight into the heart of the entity. A scream, both silent and deafening, echoed through the cavern, shaking the water and sky alike. The entity convulsed, its form unraveling into ripples of light that faded into the depths. Ilias's limbs went limp, his body buoyed by the returning calm, but his eyes remained open, watching, waiting. Above, Mara collapsed onto the shore, her breath ragged but steady. The lake's surface stilled, the moon's reflection returning to a fragile calm. The village's fate hung in the balance, the battle won but the war far from over. Elias surfaced, gasping, the weight of what he had faced pressing down like the dark water around him. "It's not over," he whispered, voice rough with exhaustion and resolve. "But we've bought time." The moon hovered just above the horizon, a hungry eye watching, waiting to consume the lake hole. And beneath its haunting glow, Elias knew the heart of darkness still pulsed fragile, but alive. As dawn threatened the night, the village of Glimmer Hollow held its breath, caught between hope and the lingering shadows of lunar madness. The air was thick with cold and anticipation as Elias Marrow stood at the water's edge, clutching the worn leather-bound book Mara had insisted upon carrying. Beside him, Mara Lawn moved with deliberate care, setting down a bundle of herbs and carefully drawn sigils on the damp earth. Old Man Harbin, leaning heavily on his gnarled cane, began murmuring words that seemed older than the village itself, his voice a gravelly thread weaving through the night stillness. "This is it," Elias whispered, his voice trembling not from the cold but the weight of what was to come. "The last chance to turn back the tide." Mara nodded, her green eyes reflecting the moon's eerie glow. "If this fails, we lose everything." The ritual had been pieced together from fragmented lore and cryptic warnings. An ancient rite said to sever the bond between the cursed moon and the lake. Old Man Harbin's tales painted it as a desperate gambit, one that demanded both courage and sacrifice. Elias felt the burden of that truth settle over him like a shroud. He knelt, tracing the symbols in the dirt with trembling fingers, each line pulsing faintly as if alive. The herbs Mara had gathered moonwort, belladonna, and elderflower were arranged meticulously, their scents mingling in the crisp night air. Old Man Harbin's chanting grew louder, each syllable reverberating against the water, stirring ripples that glimmered with unnatural light. A sudden chill swept over Elias as the lake's surface began to churn, the once placid water roiling with an otherworldly force. Shapes flickered beneath the waves' faces, twisted in silent screams, shadows that danced just beyond perception. The lunar entity was awake, resisting. Elias's heart hammered as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the talisman, a carved piece of driftwood imbued with runes from the village elders. He raised it high, the moonlight catching on its worn edges, and then plunged it into the water with a sharp cry. A shockwave rippled outward, splashing cool spray onto their faces. The lake's surface convulsed violently, and for a moment, the entity's form lifted fluid and shifting, a grotesque amalgam of light and shadow, eyes like deep wells of madness. Elias felt its gaze pierce his soul, a silent challenge. "Hold steady," Mara shouted against the roar of the water. Old Man Harbin's voice rose, chanting faster, the firelight flickering wildly as if caught in a storm. The moon's reflection wavered, the hypnotic glow dimming as if the lake itself was drawing a breath. Elias stumbled back, chest heaving, sweat chilling on his skin despite the cold. The energy of the ritual seemed to drain from him, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Yet the water calmed, the monstrous visage dissolving into ripples that caught the moonlight one last time before fading. "Is it over?" Mara asked, voice shaky but hopeful. Old Man Harbin shook his head slowly, eyes shadowed. "Not over, just delayed. The curse runs deep, rooted in this land and our history. But tonight, we have struck a blow." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of relief mingling with the knowledge that the battle was far from won. The moon's descent had paused, its light softened, but the ominous glow still lingered, a reminder of the darkness waiting beneath the surface. As the first faint stirrings of dawn colored the horizon, Elias looked back at the lake. The reflection shimmered quietly now, a fragile veil between reality and nightmare. He knew the coming days would test him and the village in ways they had never imagined. But for this moment, he allowed himself a breath of hope. "We'll fight," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "We'll fight until the last light fades." And as the sun's first rays kissed the water, the moon's glow dimmed further, retreating but never gone, leaving a lingering promise of shadows yet to come. Elias Morrow stood ankle-deep in the cold water, the chill creeping through his worn boots and biting at his skin. His breath came in steady puffs, mingling with the mist rising from the lake's surface as the night air held a heavy silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant call of a lone owl. Around him, the village of Glimmerhollow lay cloaked in darkness, windows shuttered, streets deserted, as if the entire town held its breath, waiting for what was to come. In his hands, Ilias clutched the ancient tome. Mara had brought him a fragile collection of yellowed pages scrawled with cryptic symbols and incantations, passed down through generations of village elders. The knowledge contained within was their last hope, a ritual to sever the bond between the lunar entity and the lake, to break the curse that had swallowed so many souls whole. But the price was steep. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, one that would draw from the very essence of the one who performed it. Elias's gaze lifted to the moon's reflection, a rippling mirror fractured by the gentle waves. Within that shimmering light lurked the malevolent presence that had haunted Glimmerhollow for weeks, the entity that whispered madness and beckoned the unwary to their doom. Tonight, he would face it head-on. Behind him, a faint rustle alerted Elias to Mara's presence. She stood at the edge of the water, her dark hair framing a face taut with worry and determination. Her green eyes glimmered in the moonlight, fixed on the water as if trying to pierce the veil between worlds. "Are you sure you can do this, Elias?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, carried away almost instantly by the night breeze. He swallowed hard, the weight of his past, of lost loved ones, pressing down on him. "I have too, for the village, for Jonas, for all of them." Mara nodded, stepping back to give him space. "I'll be here, whatever happens." Taking a deep breath, Elias opened the tome and began to chant the ancient incantation. The words felt foreign on his tongue, yet they resonated with a power that sent shivers down his spine. The lake responded. The surface began to glow with an eerie phosphorescent light that pulsed in time with his voice. Ripples spread out, distorting the moon's reflection into grotesque shapes and faces that writhed and shifted like living shadows. From the depths, the lunar entity stirred. Its fluid form rose slowly, a shifting mass of light and darkness that coalesced into a visage of nightmare. Twisted faces emerged, their eyes hollow and mouths stretched in silent screams. A chorus of maddening whispers filled the air, clawing at Ilias's mind, dredging up memories and fears he had long tried to bury. "You cannot win," the voices hissed, seeping into his thoughts. "Your soul will feed us. You will drown in madness." Elias's knees buckled, and for a moment, the darkness threatened to engulf him. But a flicker of resolve sparked within, fueled by love and loss, by the faces of those he sought to protect. He gritted his teeth and pushed back against the tide of despair, focusing on the ritual's words. The lake's glow intensified, the water boiling around him as the entity lashed out, tendrils of shadow reaching to drag him under. Pain lanced through Ilias's chest, searing burn as if something inside him was being torn away. His vision blurred, colors bleeding and warping, but still, he chanted, voice rising over the cacophony of whispers. On the shore, Mara's eyes widened in horror and hope. "Hold on, Elias," she cried, her voice breaking the spell of silence. "You're stronger than this." A sudden surge of light burst from Ilias's position, a pillar of radiance that shattered the entity's form, sending waves of darkness tumbling back into the depths. The lake stilled, the surface smoothing as the moon's reflection regained its gentle shimmer. Elias collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath, sweat and water mingling on his brow. His heart pounded wildly, and his limbs trembled with exhaustion and pain. Mara rushed to his side, gripping his arm. "You did it," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You saved us." But Elias barely heard her. His mind swirled with fragments of memory and shadow, the edges of reality fraying. He knew this victory came at a terrible cost. The sacrifice had taken something vital from him, something that might never return. As he looked up at the moon, now hanging still and distant in the sky, Elias felt the fragile line between sanity and madness quiver beneath his skin. The battle was won, but the war for Glimmerhollow's soul was far from over. And in the depths of the lake, something stirred, waiting, watching, patient. The night held its breath once more. Elias's sacrifice was not merely a physical toll, it was a fracture within himself. The ritual's success had weakened the lunar entity, but as he lay on the damp earth, Mara's steady hands brushing water from his hair, he felt the creeping cold of something ancient and relentless gnawing at his mind. Shadows flickered at the corners of his vision, whispers slithered just beyond comprehension. "You're safe now," Mara assured him softly, her voice a balm against the storm within. "We'll get through this. Together." He wanted to believe her. He had to. But a part of him knew the sacrifice was only a beginning. The lake, the moon, the entity, they were bound in a dance older than memory. And Elias Marrow had just become a part of that terrifying rhythm. The village's fate rested on a knife's edge, and the coming dawn would test the limits of their courage and hope. As the first pale light of morning crept over Glimmerhollow, Elias closed his eyes, clinging to the fragile thread of consciousness. The moon had been fought back, but its hunger was far from sated. And so the story of sacrifice, madness, and the fading sky wove itself deeper into the night, promising that some shadows never truly fade. Elias Marrow stood at the water's edge, the cold biting through his threadbare jacket. But it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled in his bones over these long, harrowing weeks. The moon hung low tonight, a swollen orb distorted by the rippling water. Its shimmering reflection fractured and uneven. Tonight was their last chance. Tonight, they would try to break the curse that had devoured so much of Glim. Beside Elias, Mara Lorne crouched by a hastily constructed altar made from driftwood, bone, and salt-strewn cloth. Her dark hair clung to her damp forehead as she clutched an ancient tome, her green eyes flickering with a fierce determination tempered by exhaustion. The candlelight cast flickering shadows that danced across her sharp features, lending her an ethereal quality amid the gathering darkness. "We don't have much time," Elias murmured, his voice low but steady despite the turmoil inside him. "The moon won't stay this low forever. When it rises again, the entity will grow stronger." Mara nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we do this right. No mistakes, no second chances." The village behind them was quiet, the usual sounds of night replaced by a heavy silence that pressed on their ears. The survivors had gathered in the square, faces pale and drawn, haunted by the losses they had endured, friends, family, neighbors swallowed by the lake's shimmering reflection. Sheriff Caltaine stood a little apart from the crowd, his arms crossed, jaw clenched tight. The gruff man who had once dismissed Ilias's warnings now watched with a mixture of awe and dread as the final confrontation unfolded. Elias lifted the old ritual knife, its blade catching the moonlight, and began the incantation Old Man Harbin had taught him. Words in a language long forgotten slipped from his lips, twisting and turning in the night air like a spell woven from desperation and hope. Mara joined in, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, the ancient text filling the space between them with a tangible energy. Suddenly, the lake's surface convulsed violently, the water roiling as if alive with a malevolent force. From the depths emerged the shifting, fluid form of the lunar entity light and shadow swirling together, faces and limbs flickering like cruel mirages. It reached toward them with tendrils of shimmering water, its presence a suffocating weight that threatened to drown their very sanity. "Hold steady," Elias shouted, struggling to maintain the chant as his vision blurred with tears and sweat. The entity's voice echoed in his mind, the whispering madness that clawed at the edges of his resolve. Mara's voice rose, unwavering, and the light from the altar flared. A sudden burst of brilliance that cut through the darkness. The entity screamed, a sound both human and monstrous, then began to dissipate, its form unraveling into shimmering droplets that fell like rain back into the lake. When the last ripple calmed, an eerie quiet settled over Glimmernoa. The villagers looked to the sky, where the moon, though still low, no longer pulsed with the same hypnotic menace. Yet the scars remained empty homes, shattered lives, and a community forever altered. Elias sank to his knees, the weight of victory pressing down with an unexpected heaviness. Mara knelt beside him, her hand finding his, a silent testament to their shared ordeal. Sheriff Caltaine approached slowly, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the gravity of what they had witnessed. "You did it," he said quietly, "but at what cost?" Ilias met his gaze, eyes weary but resolute. "The cost is everything. But as long as we remember, as long as we stay vigilant, maybe, just maybe, we can survive what comes next." The moonlight shimmered faintly across the lake, a last, lingering reminder of the nightmare that had almost consumed them all. And though the night seemed to breathe with a fragile stillness, the shadows whispered that the darkness was never truly gone. As the survivors dispersed into the cold night, their footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestones, Elias remained by the water's edge, staring into the fading reflection. Somewhere beneath the surface, ancient secrets still stirred, and the fragile boundary between reality and nightmare was waiting for the next tremor of madness to break it open once more. The last light of the lunar descent flickered and faded, leaving Glimmerhollow in a silence that was both an end and a beginning. Elias Marrow stood at the water's edge, the chill of the morning air seeping through his worn jacket. His eyes were fixed on the lake's glassy surface, where the faint shimmer of the moon's reflection still lingered, fragile and fading. The world seemed hushed, as though holding its breath after the night's long ordeal. He felt the weight of silence settle around him, pressing against his ribs. The lake, once a source of life and livelihood, now held the memory of horrors too deep to forget. The moon, which had drawn them all into its eerie descent, was gone from the sky, but not from their minds. Elias's gaze drifted upward to the softening sky where stars began to pale in the growing light. The boundary between night and day, between nightmare and reality, felt thinner than ever. Behind him, the village was slowly waking. The echoes of the previous night's chaos still lingered in the cracked windows and scorched earth. The dock, where so many had gathered, was now a smouldering ruin, the scent of burned wood mingling with the damp morning air. Mara, Lorne, moved with purpose through the village hall, a makeshift sanctuary transformed overnight into a refuge for the wounded and the frightened. Her sharp eyes scanned each face, offering a steady hand and words of comfort. The herbal salves she applied carried not just their healing properties, but the unspoken promise of hope amid despair. "This will ease the pain," Mara said softly to a young woman whose hands trembled uncontrollably. "We're still here. We're still fighting." Her voice, calm and resolute, was a balm to those who had lost so much. Yet beneath her strength lay exhaustion, the heavy toll of nights spent searching and nights spent mourning. Sheriff Caltaine stood outside near the ruins of the dock, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a heavy coat. His gruff features were etched with lines carved from sleepless nights and the burden of leadership in a time no earthly authority could govern. He watched as villagers sifted through the wreckage, some silently weeping, others casting wary glances at the lake, as if expecting the water itself to reach out and claim them again. "We hold together," Caltaine muttered to himself, the words a mantra against the creeping fear. "Whatever this is, it ends with us." But even as he spoke, the doubt gnawed at him. The unnatural had pierced the veil of their reality, and though the moon had retreated, something remains, something that whispered in the depths and in the shadows of the mind. Inside his cabin, Elias sat alone, the flickering fire casting long shadows that danced across the worn walls. His hands trembled slightly as he held a faded photograph a moment, frozen in happier times. His wife's smile, warm and full of light, haunted him now more than ever. He traced the edges of the photo, the paper rough under his fingertips, and closed his eyes. Memories surged, laughter on sunlit mornings, the feel of her hand in his, the unspoken promise of forever, all shattered by loss. Why did it have to come to this? He whispered into the darkness. A sudden chill crept through the room, and for a moment, the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The boundary between nightmare and reality trembled, threatening to swallow him whole. But Elias gritted his teeth, gripping the photograph tighter. "I won't let it win," he vowed, even as the moon's lingering influence clawed at the edges of his sanity. Outside, the village began the slow, painful process of healing. The sky lightened, but the scars both visible and invisible would remain. Mara's steady hands and Sheriff Caltaine's newfound resolve were threads of strength woven through the fragile fabric of survival. Yet, as the morning sun rose higher, Elias knew the true battle was far from over. The moon might have eaten the lake, but its shadow stretched long, a lingering darkness that would test the very souls of Glimmerhollow's people. In the silence of the aftermath, hope flickered tenuously, a fragile light in the gathering gloom. And somewhere, beneath the surface, the reflection waited. The moon, once a colossal orb, sinking nightly into the black mirror of the lake, was slowly retreating, climbing back into the sky with a hesitant grace. Yet, its glow was not the same. It felt thinner, more fragile, like a candle flickering against a gathering wind. The water beneath Elias's gaze rippled softly, as though breathing faint echoes of the vanished. Whispers of the souls the lunar reflection had claimed still lingering just beneath the surface. Elias's eyes, heavy with exhaustion and lingering fear, traced the moon's slow ascent. His mind wandered back to the chaos that had gripped Glimmerhollow in recent weeks, the disappearances, the hallucinations, the creeping madness that had clawed at the edges of his sanity. Though the village was quiet now, the silence was not peaceful. It was a fragile stillness, stretched thin by memories, too raw to fade. Behind him, footsteps approached softly along the path. Mara Lorne emerged from the shadows, her tall frame silhouetted against the early light. Her dark hair was tousled by the lake breeze, and her piercing green eyes held a grim determination that had grown stronger with each passing day. She carried a small satchel of herbs and ointments, a token of her role as the village's healer and historian. "The moon's climbing," she said quietly, standing beside Elias. "But I wonder if it's really leaving us, or just watching, waiting." He nodded, never turning from the lake. "It's like the lake itself is holding its breath, like it knows this isn't over." Their shared silence held the weight of unspoken fears. The villagers had begun to stir from their shock, but the wounds, both visible and unseen, still festered. Mara's knowledge of herbs and old lore had helped many, but no salve could mend the shattered trust or the creeping dread that still clouded the village's spirit. Later that morning, inside the village hall, Mara moved among the gathered survivors with practiced care. The room was filled with muted conversations, the scent of dried herbs mingling with the faint chill still lingering from the night. She knelt beside a young woman nursing a pale hand, applying a soothing poultice with steady fingers. "You're safe here," Mara murmured, her voice soft but firm. "We'll get through this, together." The woman's eyes glistened with tears, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Around them, others sat quietly, their faces etched with exhaustion and haunted memories. The village was slowly stitching itself back together, but the fabric of their lives was frayed and uncertain. Meanwhile, Sheriff Calton patrolled the near-empty streets as twilight deepened. The once bustling village had grown eerily quiet, windows shuttered against the chill and fear that still clung to the air. His heavy boots echoed on the cobblestones as he paused beneath a flickering lantern, his gaze drawn toward the shimmering lake beyond the trees. For weeks, he had resisted the whispers of the supernatural, clinging to rational explanations for the horrors that had unfolded. But now, standing alone beneath the rising moon, the rational walls he'd built felt fragile. The line between skepticism and belief blurred with every shadow cast by the moonlight. His breath misted in the cold air as he muttered, "What have we really been fighting?" As evening fell, Elias and Mara convened in his modest cabin, a sanctuary cluttered with fishing gear, worn books, and faint traces of smoke curling from the hearth. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across their faces. They spoke in low tones, sharing memories of the lost Jonas Marrow, Mara's brother, and the others who had vanished into the lake's reflection. Old Man Harbin's cryptic warnings echoed in their minds, reminding them that the ancient curse that had awakened with the moon's descent might never fully fade. "We were lucky," Mara said, her voice weighted with sorrow. "But lucky isn't the same as safe." Elias clenched his fists, the familiar sting of grief flaring anew. "We have to keep fighting, for the village, for those still here." Their resolve hardened even as uncertainty gnawed at the edges. The village of Glimmerhollow had survived the worst of the lunar terror, but the scars it bore were deep. The moon's influence, though diminished, lingered like a shadow refusing to be banished. Outside, the night deepened, and the moon hung high, its pale light casting long, wavering reflections on the lake's surface, fading echoes of a nightmare that might one day return. "We watch," Elias whispered, eyes fixed on the shimmering water, "and when the moon calls again, we'll be ready." But as the wind stirred the surface and the village settled uneasily to rest, an unspoken question lingered in the air. Had the curse truly been broken, or merely held at bay, waiting for the darkness to rise once more? The fragile peace of Glimmerhollow hung by a thread, caught between hope and the haunting possibility that the moon's hunger was far from sated. The air hung heavy with the scent of dried herbs and the faint, smoky tang of extinguished candles. Elias Marrow sat across from the elder, his eyes fixed on the wizened face etched with centuries of village history and sorrow. The old man's voice was a gravelly whisper, threading the room with stories long buried beneath years of silence. Glimmer Hollow wasn't always this quiet, Harbin began, his gnarled fingers tracing a worn map spread across the table. It was a place of light and life before the moon's shadow touched it. But the ancestors, they made a pattern, wittingly inviting the curse that festers beneath the water's surface. Elias's eyes narrowed. He had heard fragments before, yet each telling deepened the chill in his bones. The curse, it's not over. Harbin shook his head slowly, his clouded eyes meeting Elias's with a weight that crushed hope. No, lad. The curse is cyclical, tied to the moon's descent and the lake's hunger. It ebbs and flows like the tides, waiting for the next time the moon sinks too low, the next generation to be ensnared. Elias swallowed hard, the room suddenly too small, the air thick with impending doom. Then what can we do? How do we stop it? The old man's gaze softened. Knowledge is our shield, but the price is steep. To face the curse, you must confront more than just the entities, the darkness within us all. Later, Elias found himself standing alone by the lake as dusk bled into night. The sky was a bruised canvas of purple and indigo, the first stars winking faintly above the encroaching darkness. The moon hung low, fractured and shimmering on the water's surface like a fractured mirror. His breath formed small clouds in the chill air, each exhale a ghost of memories past. He thought of Jonas, lost to the reflection, of Mara, fighting desperately against the invisible tide pulling her brother deeper into madness. But beneath the grief was a gnawing fear, his own mind fraying under the relentless pull of the lunar madness. Images flickered behind his eyes. The night his wife was taken, the silence that followed, the voices whispering in the dark. A shiver ran down his spine as a sudden wind swept through the village streets, carrying with it faint murmurs, unintelligible yet heavy with warning. Shadows stretched long and twisted, twisting like fingers reaching for him. Elias's heart hammered, the unease coiling tighter within his chest. He quickened his pace, the quiet streets suddenly alien and threatening. Back in his cabin, Elias sat hunched over a cluttered table, candlelight flickering against the walls lined with maps, old diaries, and brittle documents. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the lineage of the curse, the names of those lost to the lake, the cycles of madness recorded in faded ink. The weight of history pressed down on him, yet beneath the fear was a burning resolve. He would not let Glimmerhollow fall into oblivion. Not again. The night deepened, and with it, the whispers of the past grew louder. Elias knew the road ahead was fraught with peril both from the lunar entity that haunted the lake and the shadows within himself. But as the candle guttered and the moon cast its fractured light through the window, he steeled himself for the fight to come. The curse might be eternal, but so was his determination. And in the gathering darkness, that was all that stood between the village and the creeping void. The lake whispers in the night, and the moon watches silently, waiting. The once vibrant village now bore the marks of its torment, shattered windows, splintered boats, and the hollow silence of loss. Yet, amid the ruin, the first stirrings of life returned. Villagers emerged from their homes, faces drawn but resolute. their eyes searching the horizon as if willing the sun to rise higher, to bring with it a new beginning. Elias Marrow stood at the heart of the gathering crowd, his lean frame silhouetted against the mist that curled over the water. His graying hair was tousled from restless sleep, deep lines etched into his weathered face, a map of grief, determination, and something fragile yet fiercely alive, hope. Beside him, Mara Lawn moved with purpose, her dark hair pulled back, green eyes alight with a fire that belied the exhaustion clinging to her features. Together, they had become the reluctant pillars of a village desperately clinging to survival. "We'll start here," Elias said quietly, gesturing toward the small cluster of homes nearest the lake. "The docks need rebuilding, and those boats won't fix themselves." Mara nodded, her voice steady. Old Man Harbin's journals mentioned ways to ward off the moon's influence. We can incorporate those rituals into our daily lives. It won't undo what's happened, but it can protect us moving forward. The villagers listened, some skeptical, others desperate for direction. Sheriff Caltain stood apart, arms crossed over his broad chest, his gruff demeanor softened by the visible relief that the terror had at least subsided. He stepped forward, voice firm but not unkind. "We keep order, we keep watch. No more disappearances, no more madness." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The village was fragile, but it was not broken. Work began with a rhythm born of necessity. Hands that had trembled in fear now gripped hammers and saws, mending shattered doors and patching holes in weather-beaten walls. Children played quietly nearby, their laughter tentative but healing, washing away some of the darkness that had seeped into every corner of Glimmer Hollow. As the sun climbed, Elias and Mara retreated to the old town hall, a modest building that had weathered centuries. Inside, maps and tattered manuscripts lined the walls, relics of knowledge that might yet save them. They spread out the gathered texts, poring over symbols and incantations, tracing the threads of ancient curses and forgotten rites. "The key," Mara whispered, "is balance between the moon's pull and the lake's depths. We need to reconnect the village to the natural order, to remind the lunar entity that we belong here, not it." Elias's eyes narrowed, his mind racing through memories of the battles fought beneath the moon's sickly glow. "And if it resists? If it comes back? Then we'll face it again," Mara said, placing a steady hand on his arm. Together, outside, the wind stirred the surface of the lake, ripples catching the light like shards of glass. Sheriff Caltain entered quietly, nodding toward the maps. "I'm done denying it," he said gruffly. "Whatever that was, it's real. And if you're going to fight it, I'll stand with you." A rare smile flickered on Elias's lips. "We'll need all the help we can get." Days turned into weeks. The village slowly reclaimed its spirit. Fires were rekindled, gardens replanted, and the old protective rituals wove themselves into daily life. Salt lines at doorways, moonlit prayers whispered on the wind, and herbs burned to cleanse the night air. The scars remained, but so did the strength to endure. One evening, as the sky faded from twilight to deep indigo, Elias found himself drawn once more to the lake's edge. The moon hung low, a pale sentinel casting its silvery gleam across the water, beautiful, haunting, and inscrutable. He watched the shimmering reflection ripple gently, the lake calm but alive with unseen currents. His breath caught in his throat as a chill slid down his spine. The lunar entity might have been subdued, but it was not gone. It lingered in the shadows, waiting, watching. Elias closed his eyes, the cool night air filling his lungs. He thought of the lives lost, the battles fought, and the fragile hope blossoming within the village. He would stand guard, a sentinel in turn, watching over Glimmerhallow as the new dawn rose. Because some darkness never fully fades, but neither does the light, willing to face it. And so the moon rose again, pale and watchful, as the village below breathed, healed, and prepared for whatever might come next. He stood at the edge of Glimmerhollow's shore, where the water met the earth in a seamless embrace, and the moon pale and swollen hung low in the sky, refusing to relinquish its hold on the night. Despite the fading darkness, the moon's surface shimmered with a strange vitality, the ripples across its face suggesting a restless heartbeat beneath its luminous crust. Iliase's eyes, deep-set and shadowed with years of sleepless nights, traced the subtle movements of the celestial orb. A faint unease stirred within him, not the raw terror of days past, but a cold, creeping uncertainty that whispered of unfinished business. The lake was calm, but its glassy surface betrayed an unnatural tension, as if the water itself held its breath, waiting for an inevitable return. Behind him, footsteps crunched softly on the frost-kissed grass, and Mara Lawn's familiar silhouette emerged from the mist. She carried an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, a relic from the village's past. Her green eyes, sharp and piercing, met his gaze with a mixture of determination and apprehension. "Elias," she said quietly, the wind tugging strands of dark hair across her face. "I found something in the Elders' records. There's mention of the moon's cycles, how it descends and returns, bringing with it a shadow that never fully leaves. They called it the Watcher in the sky." Elias took the journal, fingers trembling slightly as he flipped through the cryptic notes and faded illustrations. The villagers' ancestors had known of this curse, of a darkness tied to the moon's descent that fed on fear and fractured sanity. A sudden chill swept across the lake, a breath colder than the dawn air, stirring the surface into trembling waves. For a fleeting heartbeat, the moon's reflection shattered like fractured glass, casting a mosaic of grotesque, distorted faces upon the water faces twisted in silent screams, eyes hollow and accusing. Elias's breath hitched. He blinked, and the faces were gone, replaced by the placid reflection of the sky, serene and deceptive. Mara's hand tightened on the journal, her knuckles white. "It's not over," she whispered. "It never really is." They stood side by side, the first pale light of day spilling over the horizon, washing the village in fragile gold. The moon lingered stubbornly, a silent sentinel watching from the retreating night. Elias met Mara's gaze, a shared understanding passing between them. The battle for Glimmerhollow's soul had left scars deeper than the eye could see, and though the terror had receded, it had not vanished. Somewhere in the shifting boundary between sky and water, the lunar entity waited, patient and hungry. "We'll be ready," Elias said, voice steady despite the turmoil within. "Whatever comes." Mara nodded, a fierce light igniting in her eyes. Together, they turned from the lake, their silhouettes etched against the waking sky. Guardians of a village perched precariously on the edge of nightmare and dawn. But as the sun rose, casting long shadows over Glimmerhollow, the moon's pale glow did not fade entirely. It clung stubbornly to the heavens, like a watcher that never sleeps. A reminder that some darknesses are eternal and some evils merely bide their time. And so, beneath the fading stars and the burgeoning light, the watcher in the sky remained silent, inscrutable, and waiting. It hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken fears and memories too raw to forget. For weeks, the moon had begun to rise again, its familiar silver face climbing slowly back into the night sky. Yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The lake no longer shimmered with benign light. Instead, it held a restless energy, as if the water itself remembered what had transpired. And the darkness beneath was not yet done with its silent hunger. Elias Morrow stood on the shoreline just before dawn, the cold biting through his worn coat. His eyes were fixed on the lake's still surface, where faint flickers of unnatural silver glowed beneath the waning moonlight. It was an unsettling sight. The water whispered in strange rhythms, carrying sounds that were almost like voices, soft, urgent, and distant. He shivered, not entirely from the chill. The memories of what they had fought to survive clawed at his mind, refusing to let him forget the depths of horror that had nearly swallowed them all. Behind him, the village was slowly stirring. Windows glowed with the dim light of oil lamps, and the faint murmur of cautious voices drifted through the crisp air. Mara Lawn was already up, too. He knew she had been restless, her sharp green eyes reflecting the same unease that haunted him. They had faced down the lunar entity together, fought against a terror that defied reason, but the victory felt incomplete, as if the true battle was only just beginning. Inside the village hall, a tense gathering was underway. Sheriff Caltaine, his gruff demeanor softened by exhaustion, debated quietly with Mara. Their voices barely rose above a whisper, but the intensity was palpable. Reports of strange sightings had surfaced against shadows slipping beneath cabin walls, reflections in windows warping and twisting into unnatural shapes. The villagers listened with pale faces, their eyes wide and haunted, caught between hope and fear. "We can't ignore these signs," Mara insisted, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "The entity may be weakened, but it's not gone. It never truly leaves." Calton rubbed his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "I want to believe that, Mara, but the people need peace. We can't let this fear control us. We have to move forward. But at what cost?" she countered. "Will we be ready when it returns, or will we be caught unprepared like before?" The room fell silent, the weight of uncertainty pressing on every soul present. In a quieter corner of the village, Old Man Harbin sat surrounded by a small group of villagers eager for answers. His voice was a trembling but commanding thread weaving through the dim light cast by a flickering candle. He spoke of the ancient curse that had haunted Glimmer Hollow for generations, the cyclical nature of the lunar madness that rose and receded like tides, leaving scars in its wake. "Remember this," he cautioned. "The moon's descent is never truly over. It waits, biding its time beneath the waves and shadows, until the village forgets its pain and lets its guard down. Then it will rise again, hungry and relentless." His words settled like a cold shadow over the listeners, stirring a haunted reverence that mingled with their lingering dread. Night deepened once more, and Elias found himself unable to rest. Drawn back to the lake, he stood alone beneath the ink-black sky. The surface was calm, yet alive with subtle movements. Then, in the flickering light, he caught it, a fleeting, shifting figure in the lake's reflection. It mirrored his own form for a heartbeat before dissolving into ripples that spread like whispered warnings across the water. His breath caught in his throat, a cold dread settling deep within his bones. Was this a sign that the entity still lingered, or merely the torment of a mind fraying at the edges? He clenched his fists, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. There was no retreat from this place, no forgetting the darkness that had claimed so many. The village, and perhaps his very soul, was tethered to the fate of that lunar shadow. As dawn broke, casting a pale glow over Glimmer Hollow, the villagers awoke to a fragile peace. Yet beneath that fragile calm, the shadows stirred, whispering of a terror not fully vanquished. Elias and Mara exchanged a look heavy with shared understanding. They would remain vigilant, guardians against the lingering shadows that threatened to consume their home once more. The moon had risen again, but its light was cold and distant, an ambiguous beacon in the fading sky. The nightmare had ended, yet the story was far from over, and the true nature of the terror still hung in the balance, waiting for the moment when it would once again reach out from the depths to claim what was lost. And somewhere beneath the tranquil surface of the lake, the lunar entity watched and waited. The moon, now hanging impossibly low, cast a sickly luminescence that shimmered across the water's surface like liquid silver, distorted and alive. Elias's boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the undulating reflection. The village lay behind him, dark and silent, every shadow seeming to stretch and twist like a living thing. For a long moment, Elias simply stood, the cold wind tugging at his graying hair, carrying whispers that might have been the lake's breath or the echoes of lost souls. Memories clung to him like a shrewd Jonas's smile, Mara's desperate pleas, Sheriff Caltain's reluctant acceptance. The weight of all they had endured pressed down, yet Elias knew this moment was not an end but a fragile pause. From the shadows, a soft footfall broke the silence. Mara Lorne emerged, her dark hair catching the faint moonlight, eyes wide and searching. "It's still there," she murmured, voice trembling yet steady. "The reflection, it's not gone, it waits." Elias nodded, his gaze never leaving the water. "It's hungry," he said quietly, "and it remembers." Together they watched as the lake's surface rippled unnaturally. Faces flickered within the reflection, twisted, silent, pleading. The lunar entity's essence pulsed faintly beneath the water, a living nightmare bound to the moon's descent. The air vibrated with a low, haunting hum that seemed to seep into their very bones. Suddenly, Sheriff Caltain appeared, his usual gruff demeanor softened by the weight of understanding. "We can't let this happen again," he said firmly. "Not to us, not to anyone." Elias met his gaze, a shared resolve passing between them. The battle had taken so much friends, sanity, hope, but the fight was not over. As the moon's reflection shimmered and the night deepened, they stood united at the edge of the abyss, guardians against a terror that might never fully vanish. The lake was silent again, but the darkness beyond whispered a warning. The moon might eat the lake, but the lake would remember, and so would they. The night held its breath, waiting for what would come next. A cold mist began to curl over the water, wrapping the village in a spectral cloak. Elias's fingers brushed the surface of the lake, feeling the pulse beneath the heartbeat of something ancient and unyielding. His mind wrestled with the visions and voices that had haunted his nights, the faces of those lost to the reflection's embrace. "Do you think it's truly gone?" Mara's voice was barely a whisper. "No," Elias replied. "It's waiting, patient." The moon's glow flickered, and for a moment, the horizon seemed to bend, the sky blending with the water in an endless expanse of silver and shadow. The village behind them was quiet but restless, the scars of the ordeal etched into every home and heart. Sheriff Caltain lit a lantern, its warm glow a fragile beacon against the encroaching darkness. "We'll watch," he said, "and we'll be ready." Elias exhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs. "This place is our home," he said. "No matter what comes, we hold on." As the first light of dawn threatened the horizon, the three stood, sentinel eyes fixed on the lake that had swallowed so much. The moon, now a pale, distant orb, seemed to retreat yet. Its reflection lingered, a ghostly promise that the story was not finished. In the depths below, something stirred. and the moon waited to eat the lake again. Elias turned away from the water's edge, the weight of his vigil settling deep in his bones. He knew the village would never be the same. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, leaving behind a world where shadows breathed and the sky wept silver tears. But as long as he stood, as long as Mara and Kaltain stood with him, there was hope, a fragile thread woven through the darkness. And in the fading glow of the moon, that thread was all they had. The end was uncertain, the terror unresolved, but the fight endured. And so did Glimmerhol. The moon might eat the lake, but the village would not be swallowed whole. The night whispered of ancient curses, of souls lost and found, of madness and memory, and beneath the fading sky, Elias Marrow, haunted and determined, watched and waited, ready for whatever shadows the dawn would bring.